Hello everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to my first video. For this, I would just like to share a little bit about my goal here. I love to learn and I love to read. In particular, I love to comb through things in history, politics, and culture and talk at exhaust about what I find particularly interesting about those topics, usually to my girlfriend and my friends. So to save them from that, I have decided to start this channel where hopefully I can find some other people out there that actually care about the dumb things that I learn. This will also provide a time capsule of all the cool shit that I've learned. So think of it like a history-themed book club where we get to learn something new together. So that being said, please, if you like the video, comment on what you think we should do next and we'll try and tackle it. But now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into our very first deep dive. Why do we romanticize the past, and what makes somebody stand out enough to deserve a place cemented in history? Some, like the infamous man that I have just spent the last 2 weeks researching ad nauseum, are pretty baffling when you actually take a look at what they did to earn a spot in the American consciousness. The Gore mountain range, which runs 60 miles through Colorado, is a perfect example of this tendency, memorializing a man whose actions stand in stark contrast to the values that we associate with these preserved lands today. Mountains, shops, towns, entire ranges, crosses, and passes all have the name Gore slammed on it. Why? By the end of this, I think you'll be amazed at just the sheer irony in naming all of these conserved and protected areas after Gore. St. George Gore, a man of legend, but as I quickly found out, a man who did very real things along the American Rockies during the Wild West, stands out as one of the most interesting figures of the frontier, not just because of his exploration of it and his unfearing journey into the unknown, but also by cementing himself in history by putting on the most infamous 3-year hunt ever made, where he spent almost $500,000, which was an insane figure in the 1850s, with a traveling mansion by his side, a full staff of servants of people, essentially his own army, and he slaughtered thousands and thousands of animals, driving buffalo closer to extinction and not listening to anybody pleading for him to stop. His story is a classic story of American greed, excess, extravagance, and justice. Today, we are going to be taking a deep dive into exactly what happened on this hunt and how we have allowed him to become an almost heroic figure of legend, evading cultural justice and being cemented in American history, and the effects that this hunt had on the people. Sir St. George Gore's infamous hunting expedition embodies the recklessness of the frontier era, but also his legacy forces us to grapple with questions of conservation, historical memory, and who we choose to memorialize. Surprisingly, Gore wasn't even an American. He was an Irishman who traveled from his sprawling estate in southern London and pillaged and ransacked the Wild West with no regard for anyone, causing massive fights with every major group in the US, leading to a game of cat and mouse with the native tribes, the US government, and at the helm, a rich European aristocrat with an unending bag of resources at his disposal. Starting off, we have to go back a little bit and give some backstory on how Gore had not just the resources, but also the skill level to put on such an insane hunt. On top of just being rich enough to do this, there are many different accounts of his skill level and his impressive ability to kill big game animals. At his peak, he was said to have killed at least a dozen animals in a single day. Gore was the 8th Baronet of Manor Gore, which was in the county of Donegal in Northern Ireland. For the non-Brits out there, the Baronet class was the class above Knight but below Baron. The title itself did not inherently come with any land like a baron. However, in Gore's case, it very much did. The estate he inherited was over 100,000 acres. The class of baronet was founded in 1611, so when the Gore baronetage was created in 1621, it became one of the first in all of England. Paul Gore was your classic wealthy aristocrat. The first baronet of Manor Gore, Paul Gore, was a commander of his own troop, and in 1613 was made a member of parliament. He was able to use his skills as a politician to gain baronetage, which the Gore family still has to this day. This is also what led to the generational wealth that the Gore family had built up by the time that St. George was born. When George came around, the family had been immensely wealthy for generations. Born in 1811, he grew up with a typical aristocratic lifestyle. He then left and studied at Oriel College in Oxford. At 31, he then followed in his father's footsteps and became the 8th Baronet of Manor Gore. After being made Baronet, he took up residency at his Victorian mansion. This was in prime location, around 50 miles south of London in Brunswick Square, East Sussex. He also inherited the land holdings with this new title, giving him an annual income of $200,000 for doing nothing. Apparently, he barely ever visited the manor itself. He was described as a stocky bachelor, with many people noting his beard or his durundery straw-colored whiskers. They described things weirdly back then, but I'm sure he also did look bizarre, so it works. Instead of being in love with holding land, he was more in love with the land he didn't know. He had a tremendous passion for the outdoors. And on top of being an expert fisherman and marksman, he also had a deep love of the arts, William Shakespeare being his favorite. He was your textbook 19th century Victorian aristocrat. He was able to use this passion, along with his excellent education, to become a member of one of England's most exclusive social clubs, the Turf Club. Here he gained his reputation in the public as a very skilled scholar, huntsman, and horseman. However, he also first gains his reputation of having a bad temper, usually blowing up at people after he had a couple of drinks, which was very often. And I'm going to be totally honest, this is going to become an issue later. So that's Gore. Before we get into his journey, let's talk a little bit about the victim here and where it was at the time, the American West. A time of high tensions, we are jumping in right at the middle of Manifest Destiny. In 1846, James K. Polk was elected under the promise that people got to explore the country and everything was ours. Of course, there were already people living there. It doesn't matter, Manifest Destiny. Long before the gold rush came the big game rush. Like gold, this economic push led hundreds and thousands of Americans out into the Great Plains in search of riches. Called the hide hunters or buffalo runners, killing bison became the biggest of the big game kills. The tried and true best way to kill a buffalo was called a stand. This is where they would pick out a lead buffalo in a herd and shoot for the lungs from 500 yards out. Taking out the lead prevented the entire group from panicking, and they would then proceed to take out the rest without any of them running. A total massacre. The stories of the Wild West and the buffalo runners quickly become legend overseas, specifically in the UK, where big game safari hunts were all the rage for wealthy aristocrats. Stories like this are probably what led other British rich idiots, like fellow Turf Club hunter Sir William Drummond Stewart, to the American West. Stewart did a tour of the West himself from 1833 to 1838. He even went back one more time in 1843. Eventually, he made his way into hunting circles that included Gore, and Stewart left him feeling inspired to try it himself. Stewart mentioned to Gore how bountiful the West was, and how it felt that there were an infinite amount of big game scores to add to your trophy collection. Because of this, Gore wants in. There are just a couple of things he has to do first. The first thing he did to prepare for the hunt was to never marry. Whether intentional or not, sources are mixed, he never married. Either on purpose due to his drive for hunting, or just because he enjoyed the bachelor lifestyle too much. I think it's safe to say his ability to go on this 3-year hunt was indicative of his priorities in life. Second thing, he needs resources. His hunt is not going to be like any other hunt. Gore is particular. Picture like a Kardashian or a millennial planning a gender reveal party. He wants to do it his way. So, to get access to the resources he needs, he gets in touch with the American Fur Company, which will be a key player in this saga. The American Fur Company, which I'll refer to from here on out as the AFC, was a dominant 18th century fur trading company in America. Conveniently, they also had trading outposts not only all over America, specifically in St. Louis where Gore would start and end his hunt, but in London as well. He uses his connections with Stewart to get in contact with them, and Stewart assures them of his character, and he acts as his reference. He contracts them to give him all the updated maps of the West and supplies that he can trade with at any outpost. They also make a deal to exchange his Baring Brothers bank statements with any American currency at any trading outpost. Check. Final piece. He needs a federal U.S. passport so that he can get into Indian restricted land without any issues. Unfortunately, he has no means of getting in contact with the Federal Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Alfred Cummings. So, to get the type of passport he needs, he's out of luck. Not important right now, he will deal with it later. The hunt must continue, so no special passport. But he has access to the trade post, he has a bunch of US currency, and men outfitted by the AFC waiting for him in St. Louis. He's meticulous and he's exhaustingly intentional. But is he self-aware enough to get out of his own way? Will his extravagance and his disregard have any self-inflicted consequences that he can't escape? Ready or not, he begins. Gore sets sail from Southampton, but not alone. He had assembled a team of confidants and people that would make him comfortable. First, he is joined by his close friend and fellow hunter, Lord Spencer Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 6th Earl of Fitzwilliam. Cool. He, much like the Baronet of Manor Gore, was a member of the Parliament with a family name of high affluence, even for Gore. His father in particular was thought of as the richest man in all of the British aristocracy. Fitzwilliam was married, but eager to hunt despite that. So Fitzwilliam joins the team. Gore is also joined by his valet, a dog handler, and 50 hounds to assist him on the hunt. At the time of departure, Gore was 43 years old and Fitzwilliam 39. Prime hunting age, maybe? In any case, in February 1854, they would finally reach New York, and it wouldn't be another month until the group, still including the 50 hounds with the single handler by the way, would reach St. Louis. Because of this, he convenes with the AFC trading post in St. Louis, where he becomes acquainted with the king of the American Fur Company, Alexander Culbertson. Upon his first meeting, he likes Gore, but he finds him a little bit pompous. Without any real reason other than personality to go off of, he continues to help him anyways. So he gives him everything he needs. On top of that, he also gives him Indian trade goods, along with 40 men who were the best the frontier had to offer. They weren't just laborers. He had cooks, tradesmen, servants, fly tying specialists, soldiers, and linguists. Most of them were from St. Louis and around the Great Plains, nicknamed the Mountain Men. They were all extremely qualified for this hunt, since he had paid the AFC top dollar for the assembly. For his lead navigators, he actually requested them by name. Henry Chatillon was his first. One of the best guides in the entire world. Gore had heard of him previously because he famously guided historian Francis Parkman out on his tour from St. Louis along the Oregon Trail to Fort Laramie and into the Rocky Mountains. This journey ended up being written down by Parkman and published in what would become the Western literary classic, The California and Oregon Trail, written in 1849. Gore read this book in preparation for his journey, and it left him feeling so inspired to work with him that he knew he had to jump at the opportunity to hire Chatillon. He was so rich, he could read about a man and demand he be his guide for a 3-year journey. He even offered him a whopping $5 a day for his services as a guide. Sounds super low, but it was actually considered a top guide price at the time and very generous. However, that wasn't even his most prolific mountain man. Jim Bridger, his other guide, also known as Old Gabe, was the most prolific mountain man. His resume is insane. He was the first non-indigenous person to discover the Great Salt Lake in 1823. He spent 30 years traveling the Rockies, mapping and discovering all over the West. Most famously, in 1843, he developed Fort Bridger, named after himself, of course. His rough and tumble lifestyle contrasts with Gore perfectly. Gore sees Bridger and his life of adventure and feels some level of envy. He is a true adventurer. And a side note about him, in 1846, the Donner Party came through Fort Bridger, and he assured them that the shortcut they wanted to take was super safe, and he encouraged them to take it. He wasn't just brought on as a guide, but also as Gore's personal chauffeur and travel companion. Despite not being able to read, the scholarly Gore took to Bridger quickly. The surprising friendship, Gore, the 8th Baronet and heir to the Manor Gore fortune, and Bridger, the orphan son of a tavern keeper, became fast friends. He was always intrigued by his tales of the West and his funny way of talking, and from Gore's perspective, having someone who knew the West like the back of his belt and was such a master woodsman was a lifelong goal. As spring of 1854 came to a close and the grass had grown to the perfect length, Gore got his final missing piece. Alfred Cumming approved his request and he received a passport to travel into Indian country. His ambition was paying off, and they were ready to hunt. As they put it, their quest was in search of anything that walked, bawled, flew, or swam, and that is exactly what happened. Because this is a Gore hunt, the traveling circus is really something to behold. By the time they leave their AFC trading post at St. Louis, he has already amassed an army to help. He is ensuring to make good on his word to kill absolutely everything that he sees. Chatillon pointed the procession in the right direction as the lead guide, and the next carriage was Gore's, with Bridger in the nice leather driver's seat. In the carriage itself lounged Gore and Fitzwilliam, comfortable in their sun-shaded padded seats. This carriage conveniently converted nicely into Gore's sleeping chambers too. Also, he embedded in the carriage specific springs to make the ride a little bit more comfortable for himself. No other carriages had this. Behind the trail dust of his carriage followed 21 other carts, each two-wheel, single carts, which had all been painted an eye-hurting red for some reason. 16 of these carts were used only to carry Gore's stuff, one fully used to only carry his arsenal of weapons, which nobody except for him was allowed to touch, with 5 other carriages behind that carrying the gear of the 40 other men and some Indian trade goods in case they needed some more supplies from the tribes. Following those carts were the 4 large Conestoga wagons, each being pulled by 6 horses. These wagons carried the food and any tools. Just to make sure that there were no delays in the hunt, they also had a full blacksmith shop to fix any breakdowns so they wouldn't have to go into town. Not done, by the way. In the back of the procession were 2 commercial freight wagons, which were each hauled by an 8 yoke of oxen, and carried the bulk supplies for the long term, like picture a Costco on wheels. And finally, in the way back was the horsemen, which herded the expedition's stock. For that home feeling, the procession also included cows so that Gore could have his traditional British breakfast porridge whenever he wanted. And then scattered along at random were his 50 hounds, of course, sniffing everything and anything, digging, chasing birds, and consuming any small animal in their path, ensuring that it wasn't just the big game species that they were gunning to destroy in the Rockies. During the nights when the procession stopped, the hired mountain men and laborers erected the luxurious camp, which started by first erecting a 16 by 20 foot, green and white striped canvas wall tent. Inside, they laid down a full India rubber pad, which was then covered by thick and lavish French carpets. They then lugged from the freight wagons the furniture. 2 wood-burning heater stoves, oval steel bathtub with the Gore family crest embossed on both sides, a portable iron table and a matching washstand, an ornamental brass bedstead, and a feather bed, 2 lounge chairs, an oak dining table, a single oak chair, dinnerware of the finest English pewter, heavy trunks containing the baronet's extensive wardrobe and his large collection of leather-bound classics, a fur-seated commode with removable pot, and anything else he might need. So there's more. Whew, that was a mouthful. Okay. After all that, with a massive tent for Gore, he then proceeded to eat alone every single night. He strictly prohibited any of the hired men to enter his tent for any reason, except for the ones that doubled at night as his waiters. The frontiersmen had to dress up before serving him, and the menu, for him only of course, included the fresh catches of the day and the big game kills. Along with that, he also had his imported wines, Irish whiskeys, and brandies. According to records, Gore would spend the night reading alone and getting absolutely hammered by himself, and then staying up far past midnight. His hired hands were expected to get up at 5 in the morning to begin the travel for the next day, while he could kind of lounge in and sometimes would sleep into noon. I know that was super long-winded, but the scale of this is important to keep in mind for when he starts making enemies. All the other travelers out west, like the Mormons heading for Utah in their little carriages and the families on their way to the west coast, frequently remarked at just the monument that was Gore's traveling circus. The hunt had begun in the spring, and by mid-July, people were already starting to complain at the carnage that this traveling animal slaughterhouse was committing. During this first summer, Gore and Fitzwilliam were killing over a dozen big game animals a day. Other than the small complaints, the hunt would remain relatively frictionless, keeping the support of the AFC and the Office of Indian Affairs. Gore and Fitzwilliam would spend the day chasing bison, coyotes, elk, deer, timber wolves, and birds all over the Rockies. By June, the convoy had reached Fort Laramie, another AFC trading post. Here, Gore hires another set of trappers to his team, and they pause long enough for Henry Chatillon to step down as the lead guide. Worry not, though. In his absence, his brother Joseph steps in to carry out the large task. Legend says that his relationship with the local Native American tribes was so good that he was able to get over 800 of them to help build bridges and roads on paths the tribes knew that they were going to take. The route that they took during this period was referred to as a hunter's paradise. Time did not exist. Gore would wake up whenever, he would go out with Fitzgerald to hunt, and then he would fish. This period did not last long, however, once the winter started to come in. They then made their way back to Fort Laramie, where they took the winter months to give the time for the animals to recuperate. Very generous. Here, Fitzwilliam leaves for St. Louis on his own and returns to England. From here on out, it is the Gore Show. During the winter, Gore continues his idolization of the Wild West by meeting traveling Native Americans. He also meets traders, trappers, and adventurers who would stop through the fort. Conversely, the Americans were amazed by Gore's expensive equipment. A total study in contrasts. Here, Gore commits to staying in America as long as he can. He's having the time of his life. What could happen? The winter ended, and in spring of 1855, Gore was itching to get back out there. So he hires most of the same men, with Bridger as his new chief guide, and they move out with old Gabe pointing the way. In the nighttime, Gore now allows Bridger to join him in his cabin. He is still enthralled by his stories, and in one account, Gore shares with him some of his favorite Shakespeare writings. In response, Bridger, "Reckon was a little too high-faultin' for him." Don't know what that means. Gore often read with him, with Bridger's favorite being The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. During this time, he is still described by other huntsmen as the noblest roamer of them all. However, in the summer of 1855, one of Gore's men by the name of Uno dies under his employ. While accounts say it happened under natural causes and was not at the fault of Gore's strict labor expectations, he is extremely well liked by the other men, and this is considered a huge hit to the company's morale. Reminding us of Gore's true nature of wanting things his way, the mountain men plead with him to give Uno a traditional mountain man fur trade burial. Gore, being the man who pays them all, refuses to even consider this. And instead of this requested funeral by his friends, or sending the body back home so he can be given his own funeral, Gore forces him to be given a Christian funeral. In response to this, instead of making things safer, he begins to oversee the construction of Fort Gore, which the build will last the remainder of the hunt. While supervising, he continues to hunt all over Yellowstone. The local native tribes see this fort being built as a sign that Gore is not slowing down, and they decide to finally say something. They complain to the Office of Indian Affairs, however, this gets completely ignored. As they wait, the winter comes again, and just like that, another year is done, and Gore is showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, he figures out a way to maintain his hunting routine throughout the winter. Water buffalo are still here, and so are all of his guns. So, with a skeleton crew, he still manages to slaughter at his own rapid pace. This enrages the local tribes even further. So, in order to preserve their primary source of food, which is rapidly depleting at the hands of Gore, they decide to take matters into their own hands. This is not just an attack on buffalo. This is an attack on the entire tribe's main source of food. Not only that, but the buffalo are a huge spiritual connection for their culture. And when the buffalo population diminishes, typically the native population follows suit. This anger is exacerbated when it is discovered that they aren't even eating most of the kills. The tongues at the time sold for 50 cents each, making them the most profitable part of the beast, along with the hides. Because of this, and because the rest of the buffalo wasn't nearly as profitable, they typically left most of the animal to rot, completely wasting what could have fed an entire tribe by the dozens a day. What started as a beautiful landscape full of flocks of bison and elk was slowly turning into a graveyard of rotting flesh. This, coupled with the rapid pace of the slaughter, led to a serious famine for the tribes in the Rockies. A local tribe that had been keeping an eye on him estimated a kill count of over 100 bears, 2,000 bison, 1,600 elk. This left the tribes desperate, and with no help from Indian Affairs, they were forced to deal with it themselves. One night, while the convoy is still docked for the winter, a tribe of pagan natives sneak into the fort and are able to steal around 40 horses. Enraged, Gore sends a band of his mountain men after them. The chase goes on for days, through the blistering and snowy Rocky Mountain wilderness. They manage to stay hot on their trails for over 60 miles before being decimated by a heavy blizzard, which allows the natives to successfully escape with the horses. This is the beginning of Gore's frustrations and makes him come to the first realization that he might be overstaying his welcome. Instead of leaving, this act causes him to double his nighttime security, and later on in the winter, when a different tribe tries the same thing, he is ready to foil it. His men fire at the natives, and in this second altercation, a Native American is greatly injured in the fight. Turns out that it wasn't just any native. Named Big Plume, he was brothers-in-law with Alexander Culbertson, the aforementioned king of the American Fur Company. Alexander already didn't like Gore, and his opinion on him continued to sour as the hunt progressed, but this makes it extremely personal for him. The next year, he continued onward, maintaining his little regard for the tribe's pleas, while his relationship with both the natives and the Americans continued to deteriorate. The fort neared completion, and Gore kept on hunting. He was fully aware of the reputation and the animosity that was building towards him. He was somehow able to know all of this and yet never once lowered his standard of Victorian elegance. Here he starts to be known as the slob hunter, far from the noblest roamer of all title that he'd been given just a year prior. As a testament to how Gore was handling working with this large group of men, when they were hunting in the Black Hills deep in South Dakota in the summer of 1856, one of his men recounted that there was a massive gold discovery. In the waters of the Belforts, the mountain man, a guy by the name of Jeremiah, exclaimed that he had found yellow-looking stuff in the water. By his own account, in 1877, he took off his shirt and scooped up all the gold he could. He then went back to camp with his gold, where he immediately caught Gore's attention. When Gore saw him, he began to laugh. "That's not gold, that's mica," Gore mocked. Jeremiah wasn't as versed in gold as the aristocratic Gore was, and so he believed him. They placed the mica into black bottles, and Gore put them in a chest in his quarters. A few days go by, and they hurry to leave the Black Hills. Once they were gone, George then revealed to Jeremiah that it was indeed gold, and Gore pushed them quickly out of the Black Hills to prevent his men from deserting his hunt for the riches that they now knew was there. Jeremiah was furious, so to silence him, Gore doubled his salary for a month and kept the rest of the money from the gold for himself. The Americans that had been living up in the Rockies were also growing tired of him and his spectacle. Many accounts describe his own frontiersmen as getting a little sick of the murders themselves, and the sheer volume making them sick. By this point, however, they had ventured south down the Missouri River, where the hunt could have easily ended. It had been going on for 2 years, and by the time he arrived at Fort Union along the river, where the AFC's trade network was headquartered by Cuthbertson and day-to-day operator James Kipp, who was 70 years old at the time, he understandably received a very cold welcome by the AFC and the residents, who did not appreciate the sports hunting that Gore had been now performing for so long. Kipp, who had his animosity towards the slob hunter due to him having to field complaints from the Piegan and Crow tribes all winter, was a company man first and foremost, and despite the possibility of sticking with Gore hurting the trade deals that they had set up with the tribes, he decided to reluctantly stick with Gore. Kipp and Cuthbertson were both conveniently at the fort during this time and were able to work it out with Gore in person. Gore wanted to make a deal with Kipp, and since the men on his employ had diminished greatly during the 1855 and 1856 hunts, he wanted to sell all the goods in carts that he had a surplus of to the AFC. And as Kipp promised, he would remain loyal to their agreement and be willing to work out a deal, as long as the terms were fair. Gore also demanded that the AFC build boats for him and all of his remaining group to make sure that he could get down the Missouri River, and in return, he would offset some of the price of the goods. Kipp was skeptical of this because it meant that the hunt would continue on even longer and spread deep into the South. Reservations aside, he let Gore know that this would be possible, but only if his men could take 5 weeks to complete the construction of the boats. Surprisingly, and much to the annoyance of Kipp, Gore was completely fine with this delay. He had yet to hunt in the area surrounding the fort, so delighted, he'd stay as he continued to work out the deal for his goods while hunting whenever he could. His men spent that time hunting and separating their surplus of goods for the AFC across the river from the fort, and after a couple of weeks, this had been completed. So he gathered the goods, spent the day drinking whiskey and getting pissed drunk, and went to negotiate. However, according to accounts, he came in aggressive and angry. He was asking for too much and felt that Kipp was trying to take advantage of him because of their remoteness from anyone else to trade with. The negotiations ended in Kipp retreating back into his fort and Gore storming off back to his camp, where he stormed into his tent and continued to get plastered on Irish whiskey. In his drunken haze, he finally reaches a plan. He decides to take all of his items, the wagons, the French carpets, the Gore-crested bathtubs, the tables, the feathered beds, including his own, and everything else and a few men could get their hands on, and took it to the front gates of the fort to show Kipp the sheer volume of goods that he had. Still in a frenzy, he jumped up onto the top of the wagon and proceeded to douse it all in oil. And to finish it off, his excellent negotiation skills, he lit it all on fire. As the flames rose, so did his anger. Taunting the AFC, soon everything was engulfed in flames. With his growing anger, he ordered his men to go back and grab more stuff, leather-bound books, his bank statements, anything that they could get their hands on, and add it to the massive fire. The fire went on for hours. He would rather turn his good to ash than negotiate a second longer with the AFC. In this frenzy, Gore realizes he actually needs the bank statements, and he rushes into the fire to salvage it. A little too late, it's all gone. At the last second, he was able to save his Indian reservation passport, which he had also thrown into the fire. Fire still blazing, he called all the non-AFC men in the fort to come to his camp and have a party. As the fire raged deep into the next day, they continued their drunken rager. The fort walls itself begun to catch flames before it was all faded out. Without the ability to reflect or consider consequences to his actions, Gore wasn't finished. When he realized that the scrap metal would survive the fire, he and some of his men marched back to the fort and took the metal back. As an extra middle finger to them, he then threw all the metal into the Missouri River, officially ending the negotiation. Good work. Now, without money and trade closed to the only people that were willing to help him, he found himself officially out of resources. He could now no longer have the boats that were almost finished constructing, and besides some horses and 2 Yellowstone River flatboats, he only had some of his big game trophies left. If he wanted to stay, he was going to have to sacrifice his lifestyle. In keeping his priorities straight, he sends the trophies on his 2 riverboats down the Missouri River to St. Louis so that he could get them back to England. And with the remaining horses, he continued to hunt. There are many instances where this hunt could have easily ended if it weren't for the headstrong Gore refusing to let the West win. Bridger, who is the only person from the start that was still with him, continues to guide Gore down the Missouri River Trail, some 1,700 miles back to St. Louis. I have no evidence to back this up, but Bridger was probably loving all of this. With only one map left, which Bridger and Gore had studied in and out, they couldn't ignore a section on it that was labeled in big, bold lettering, unexplored. Capturing the aristocrats' attention, they had to explore it. Despite how dire their situation was, Gore could not resist his own thirst and knew it had to be teeming with wildlife. So, using what little he had left, they veered away from St. Louis, down from 40 men at the start, now to 11. The journey did prove bountiful. They returned to their roots of 1854, chasing down bison and elk, bears, deer, wolves, like nothing had even changed. Unbeknownst to them, they had just traveled deep into the Teton Sioux territory, violating Gore's passport provisions. They were in trouble. I don't know. They had veered 300 miles off the Missouri Trail, and at this point, the lands that they were blissfully decimating were far into mysterious wilderness with no civilization close by in any direction. As the 13-man party made it close to the Inyan-Cara Mountains, they began to hear a thundering noise. An earthquake? No. Before they knew it, a 135-person war party had them surrounded. Typically, their plan to put a stop to white men that had traveled into their territory was simply to kill them. They instead issued the party an ultimatum. They could either stand and fight at more than 10-to-1 odds, or, quite simply, they could abandon everything they had, clothes included, and return home on foot. Butt-ass naked. Maybe the decision Gore needed to finally end this hunt, because he may have been arrogant, bipolar, drunk, greedy, and exhaustingly headstrong, but he knew the choice was either public embarrassment or death. They chose to surrender, and finally, the once great Gore party of over 40 men and $500,000 worth of the highest-end supplies in the world had been broken down to nothing. Absolutely nothing. For 5 weeks, the 13 men wandered through the wilderness, completely naked. Ironically, surviving off of the small foods like squirrels and birds, eggs and berries. They only traveled at night to help their survival chances from any other parties, and after nearly 300 miles of on-foot travel, barely surviving, they finally received salvation. Also somewhat ironically, it came at the hands of a native tribe. Friendly Hidasta tribe members discovered the gang and provided them shelter in late 1856. Bridger could no longer do it. He and his men, after being fed and reclothed, left the tribe and returned to St. Louis, leaving Gore, his dog handler, and his valet. The 3 people that he had left Southampton with 3 years prior. For the next year, and the final months of the hunt, Gore lived like a true native, becoming engulfed in the Hidasta culture instead of the rich aristocratic lifestyle that he had been living in for most of the hunt. He wanted the real experience, and whether he liked it or not, here he got it. Without any money or resources to leave, he was forced to stay and continue there. In July, Gore finally made a deal with the competitor of AFC and boarded a Twilight steamboat. This steamboat finally returned him to St. Louis, where he spent his final 2 months socializing and recovering his trophies. And that late summer, he, his valet and dog handler, along with the dogs that had survived the journey, all returned to New York and finally to London, where he arrived just in time to join a Scottish stag hunt. That was the first and last time Gore had ever seen the American West. He would come back to America in 1876, late in his life, to the Florida Everglades, but this trip was much more contained and lacked any of the real controversy or adventure. Gore would pass away 2 years later in 1878 in Scotland at the age of 67. And there you have it, the story of the most gruesome hunt that ever took place. By the end of the Gentleman's Safari, scholars estimate that the death toll from Gore and his group was totaled at 4,500 buffalo, 1,500 elk, 2,000 deer, 1,500 antelope, 500 bears, and hundreds of smaller animals and birds. And now, with hundreds of conservation parks and mountains named after him, it begs the question, why? He was a brash Scottish aristocrat who journeyed into the lively West after paying his way into a passport with unlimited resources, discovered nothing, destroyed everything in his path, and ignored anyone begging him to stop by just throwing money at them. Ironically, his name is now forever synonymous with the very lands he spent years decimating. Buffalo would continue to be hunted, not all at the fault of Gore, but his arrogant way of life was prevalent, and people like him were the reason why buffalo were nearly driven to extinction by the end of the 19th century. For the following decades, Native Americans would continue to push for regulation in the big game hunting sector, including the Buffalo Protection Bill, which passed the House but was killed by Ulysses S. Grant. The survival of the species was seen as a metaphor for the Native Americans themselves. With the government unwilling to step in and stop this, the native populations continued to decline proportionately with the bison. Luckily, with the help of nonprofits like the American Bison Society, the species was saved. I don't say all this to say that we need to change all of the things that we've named after him now. That will not undo his injustices, but now whenever you're driving across the country and you see a Gore River or a shop with his name on it, you will know the real story. And when you see other places with other names, know that there is always a deep tapestry of context behind it, and nobody is deserving of blind romanticization. Especially the Celtic Nimrod of the Old West. Oh my God. Wow, that was a story I probably could have told in 10 minutes. But now you know absolutely everything about a random man from the 19th century who doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Either way, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. In retrospect, a side of me that I hate kind of respects Gore just for his sheer stubbornness. Anyways, please like if you had fun or slept well to it, and comment on what I should do next. Thank you.